The jungle had been screaming for 3 days straight. Commander Sarah Chen pressed her back against the massive trunk of what the locals called a ghost bark tree, its pale surface cool against her sweat-soaked uniform. Through her helmet's display, thermal readings painted the Kepler 442b forest in shades of amber and crimson. Everything was too hot, too alive, too wrong. "Contact report," she whispered into her comb, watching the audio waves flatten into nothing on her display. The silence dampener was working perfectly, creating a bubble of absolute quiet around her squad. No sound could escape their 20-meter perimeter, and, more importantly, nothing could get in. The screaming had started when the Zephyrian expedition went dark. Dr. Marcus Webb crouched beside her, his xenobiology scanner painting impossible readings across his visor. "The biosignatures don't make sense," he muttered, his voice carried only through their linked helmet systems. "Everything in this jungle is connected to something else. It's like the entire ecosystem is one massive neural network." Sarah nodded grimly. The Zephyrians had come to Kepler 442b 6 months ago, confident in their superior technology and centuries of successful colonization. They were apex predators in their own right, standing 8 feet tall with natural armor plating and electromagnetic pulse abilities that could disable most electronics from 50 meters away. When they went silent during what should have been a routine survey mission, every species in the Galactic Council had taken notice. Humans were the obvious choice for a rescue mission. Not because they were the strongest or the smartest, but because they were expendable. At least, that's what the Council believed. Sergeant Mike Rodriguez emerged from behind a cluster of crystalline ferns, his heavy plasma rifle tracking movement through the dense undergrowth. "Found their camp," he reported through the comlink. "Or what's left of it." The Zephyrian base camp had been carved into a clearing 2 kilometers from the landing zone. Now it looked like nature had reclaimed it in fast forward. Vines thick as a human torso wound through collapsed prefab structures. Bioluminescent fungi had consumed the power cores, pulsing with an eerie blue-green light that made Sarah's teeth ache. Most disturbing were the trees that had grown through the center of the command module, their branches forming perfect geometric patterns that couldn't possibly be natural. "How long did you say the Zephyrians were here?" asked Corporal Lisa Park, their communications specialist, as she knelt beside what had once been a data terminal. 6 months, Sarah replied, studying the impossible growth patterns. "This level of plant integration should take decades." Webb was already scanning the organic matter coating the Zephyrian equipment. "The cellular structure is wrong," he announced. "These aren't native plants. They're chimeric combinations of local flora and something else. Something that's been modified at the genetic level." A sound like distant thunder rolled through the jungle, felt more than heard through the soles of their boots. Sarah's silence dampener flickered for a moment, and, in that instant, the screaming rushed in like a physical force. It wasn't the cry of any animal they recognized. It was harmonic, layered, as if thousands of voices were trying to form words in a language that predated speech. "Dampener back online," Rodriguez announced, sweat beading on his dark forehead. "But, the power cell is draining faster than expected. We've got maybe 18 hours of silence left." Sarah studied the readings on her tactical display. The jungle around them was showing massive electrical activity, as if the very trees were thinking. Every plant, every vine, every piece of fungi was connected through an underground root network that stretched for kilometers in every direction. The bioelectrical patterns were too organized to be natural. "Webb, I need you to test something," she said, pulling her sidearm. "I want to see what happens when we damage the network." The xenobiologist's eyes widened behind his visor. "Commander, if this is truly a connected ecosystem, any damage we cause could trigger a defensive response from the entire forest. That's what I'm counting on." Sarah aimed her plasma pistol at a cluster of the geometric branches and fired. The superheated bolt carved through the alien wood like butter, sending sparks and sap flying. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the jungle began to move. Every tree within 100 meters started swaying in perfect synchronization, despite the complete absence of wind. The bioluminescent fungi pulsed in rapid sequences, creating waves of light that rippled outward from their position like ripples on a pond. Underground, something vast was shifting. "Seismic activity," Park reported, her voice tight with controlled fear. Something big is moving beneath us. The screaming grew louder, pressing against their silence dampener like water against a dam. Sarah could see the strain on the device's power indicators as it fought to maintain their protective bubble of quiet. "We need to find the Zephyrians," she declared, checking her weapons charge. "Whatever happened to them, it's connected to this network. And I'm betting they're still alive." Rodriguez hefted his rifle. "How can you be sure?" Sarah pointed to a section of the modified trees where the bark had formed strange, repeating patterns. Upon closer inspection, the designs looked almost like text, but in no language any of them recognized. More disturbing were the sections that looked suspiciously like Zephyrian script. "Because the jungle is trying to communicate with us," she said. "And it's using their language to do it." Webb approached one of the modified trees, his scanner working overtime to analyze the bark patterns. "Commander, these aren't just random growths. The cellular structure has been deliberately altered to form these shapes. It's like the forest is trying to write messages in the trees themselves." The implications hit them all at once. Whatever intelligence controlled this jungle hadn't simply killed the Zephyrian expedition. It had absorbed them, integrated them, learned from them. And now it was trying to use that knowledge to communicate. "Pack it up," Sarah ordered, her mind already racing through tactical possibilities. "We need to reach their original survey site before nightfall. If the Zephyrians are still alive somewhere in this network, that's where we'll find them." As they prepared to move deeper into the alien forest, the patterns in the bark seemed to shift and change, as if the jungle itself was watching them leave. The silence dampener hummed reassuringly around them, but Sarah knew it was only a temporary reprieve. Eventually, they would have to face whatever had taken the Zephyrians. And, when that moment came, she intended to be ready. The jungle stretched endlessly ahead of them, a maze of twisted branches and impossible geometry. Every step took them further from their landing zone and deeper into an ecosystem that defied every rule of biology they thought they knew. But humans had one advantage that no other species in the galaxy possessed. They were too stubborn to know when they were beaten. Rodriguez took point as they moved through the dense undergrowth, his rifle sweeping for threats that might not even be visible to conventional sensors. Behind him, Park monitored their communications array, searching for any trace of Zephyrian signals in the electromagnetic chaos of the forest. Webb continued his scans, building a three-dimensional map of the root network that seemed to extend far deeper than any natural ecosystem should allow. And Sarah watched it all, her tactical mind processing every detail, every anomaly, every impossible thing that suggested they were dealing with something far more dangerous than a simple hostile environment. The Zephyrians were apex predators, feared throughout the galaxy for their natural weapons and tactical brilliance. If something had been able to take them without a fight, without even a distress signal, then humanity was facing a threat unlike anything they had ever encountered. But, as Sarah checked her weapons one more time and led her team deeper into the screaming jungle, she couldn't help but smile. After all, humans had a long history of fighting impossible odds. And they usually won. The Zephyrian survey site revealed its secrets slowly, like a puzzle box designed by a madman. Sarah's team had been moving through the jungle for 6 hours when they discovered the first hybrid. It hung suspended 30 feet above the ground, caught in a web of crystalline vines that pulsed with the same blue-green bioluminescence they had seen at the base camp. At first glance, it looked like a standard survey drone, its sleek metallic surface reflecting the filtered sunlight that managed to penetrate the canopy. But drones didn't breathe. "Jesus Christ," whispered Rodriguez, lowering his rifle as he stared up at the impossible sight. "Is that thing alive?" Webb had his scanner trained on the hybrid before anyone could stop him, his scientific curiosity overriding basic survival instincts. The readings that came back made no sense according to any known principles of biology or engineering. "It's both organic and mechanical," he announced, his voice filled with a mixture of wonder and terror. "The neural pathways are biological, but they're interfaced directly with quantum processing matrices. It's like someone built a brain around a computer, or maybe grew a computer inside a brain." The hybrid shifted slightly in its crystalline cocoon, and, for a brief moment, its optical sensors focused directly on Sarah's position. The intelligence behind those artificial eyes was unmistakable. Whatever this thing was, it was aware, conscious, and studying them with the same intensity that they were studying it. Commander, Park's voice carried a note of urgency as she monitored her communication equipment. I'm picking up electromagnetic patterns from the hybrid. It's trying to establish a data link with our systems. Sarah made a quick decision that would have horrified the Xenobiology Protocol's manual. Let it connect. Ma'am? If this thing was created from Zephyrian technology, it might have information about what happened to the expedition. We need to know what we're dealing with. Webb looked like he was about to protest, but Sarah cut him off with a gesture. She had spent 10 years in the Galactic Defense Corps, and she had learned to trust her instincts. Right now, those instincts were telling her that conventional tactics weren't going to work against whatever intelligence controlled this jungle. Park established a heavily filtered connection, routing the hybrid signal through multiple firewalls and isolation protocols. What came through wasn't data in any recognizable format. Instead, it was a stream of sensory information that bypassed their equipment entirely and spoke directly to their minds. Images flooded Sarah's consciousness. The Zephyrian expedition, 8 proud warriors armed with the most advanced weapons their civilization could provide, landing in the jungle 6 months ago. Their initial surveys, mapping the incredible biodiversity and cataloging species that had never been seen anywhere else in the galaxy. The discovery of the root network, far more complex and extensive than any natural ecosystem. And, then, the contact. The intelligence that lived in the jungle was old beyond measure, a collective consciousness that had been growing and evolving for millions of years. It had watched civilizations rise and fall on distant worlds, had learned about technology and warfare and the terrible beauty of sapient thought through the electromagnetic signals that leaked across space from 1,000 different species. But it had never encountered anything like the Zephyrians. The images shifted, showing the moment when the expedition's senior xenobiologist had attempted to take a sample from one of the connected root systems. The jungle's response had been immediate and overwhelming. Not an attack, but an invitation. The intelligence wanted to understand these strange visitors, to learn everything about their technology, their culture, their way of thinking. The Zephyrians had fought back, of course. Their plasma weapons had carved through acres of forest, their electromagnetic pulse generators had disrupted the bioelectrical networks for kilometers in every direction. But, for every connection they severed, 10 more formed. For every section of jungle they destroyed, the intelligence learned more about their tactics and technology. In the end, the forest had simply absorbed them. The images showed Zephyrian warriors being integrated into the network, their consciousness preserved and expanded as they became part of something infinitely larger than themselves. They were still alive, still thinking, still aware. But they were no longer entirely Zephyrian. Sarah pulled back from the connection, her head spinning from the flood of alien memories. Around her, her team was recovering from their own experiences, each processing the impossible information they had received. "They're not dead," she announced, her voice steady despite the chaos in her mind. "The Zephyrians are still alive, but they've been changed. Integrated into this collective intelligence." Rodriguez checked his rifle's power cell, a reflexive gesture that spoke to his growing unease. "So what's the plan, Commander? We can't fight an entire forest." Sarah studied the hybrid hanging above them, its optical sensors tracking their movements with predatory precision. The Galactic Council had sent them here expecting them to fail. Humanity was considered one of the younger, less advanced species in the galactic community. They didn't have the Zephyrians' natural armor or electromagnetic abilities. They didn't have the crystallines' ability to interface directly with quantum computers or the Voidwalkers' mastery of spacetime manipulation. What they had was something that the other species often overlooked. They were adaptable. More than that, they were stubborn enough to keep fighting even when logic said they should surrender. "We're going to do what humans do best," Sarah declared, pulling a small device from her equipment pack. "We're going to cheat." The device was a prototype quantum disruptor, designed by human engineers who specialized in taking alien technology and turning it into weapons. It wasn't particularly powerful compared to the energy weapons carried by other species, but it had one unique property that made it invaluable in situations like this. It could sever quantum entanglement links. The root network that connected every plant in the jungle operated on quantum-level communication protocols, allowing instantaneous information transfer across vast distances. It was an incredibly sophisticated system that had taken millions of years to evolve. It was also completely dependent on maintaining quantum coherence across billions of individual connections. "Webb, I need you to map the network's primary connection nodes," Sarah ordered, checking the disruptor's charge. "Park, start broadcasting human music on all available frequencies. Something loud and chaotic." "Music?" Park asked, her fingers already dancing across her communication console. "The intelligence learns by absorbing and analyzing patterns. Human music is deliberately unpredictable, full of emotional content that doesn't follow logical progressions. It should confuse the network's pattern-matching algorithms long enough for us to do what we need to do." The sound of electric guitars and pounding drums began echoing through the jungle, carried by Park's powerful transmitters. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The hybrid above them began convulsing in its crystalline web, its optical sensors flickering as it struggled to process the chaotic auditory input. Throughout the forest, the bioluminescent patterns in the fungi began pulsing erratically. Webb had found what they were looking for. His scanner revealed a massive concentration of quantum activity less than a kilometer away, where the root network formed a natural nexus point. If they could disrupt the quantum entanglement at that location, it would create a cascade failure that would temporarily sever the intelligence's connection to this section of the forest. "That's where we'll find the Zephyrians," Sarah announced, leading her team toward the nexus. "Whatever's left of them." The jungle fought them every step of the way. Vines reached out to entangle their legs, while the very ground seemed to shift and move beneath their feet. The hybrid had broken free of its crystalline web and was following them through the canopy, its movements unnaturally fluid as it swung from branch to branch like some impossible fusion of monkey and machine. But the music was working. The intelligence's responses were becoming more erratic, less coordinated. It was like watching a master chess player suddenly forced to play 10 games simultaneously while listening to heavy metal at maximum volume. They reached the nexus just as the silence dampener's power cell finally gave out. The screaming hit them like a physical force, no longer the harmonious chorus they had heard before but a cacophony of rage and confusion. The intelligence was trying to communicate, to understand these strange visitors who seemed immune to its methods of integration, but human music had introduced too much chaos into its carefully ordered thought processes. The nexus itself was a marvel of biological engineering. Thousands of root systems converged on a natural depression in the jungle floor, forming a living amphitheater where bioelectrical activity reached incredible intensities. At the center, partially embedded in the organic matrix, were the Zephyrians. They were alive, but changed. Their natural armor had been supplemented with crystalline growths that pulsed with the same bioluminescence as the rest of the forest. Neural interface cables, grown rather than manufactured, connected their skulls to the network. Their eyes had been replaced with organic optical sensors that could perceive across the entire electromagnetic spectrum. And they were aware. "Humans," spoke the lead Zephyrian, its voice carrying harmonics that suggested it was no longer speaking with just its own vocal cords. "We remember you. Small. Weak. Primitive." Sarah stepped forward, the quantum disruptor humming in her hands. "Maybe. But we're here to get you out." The hybrid Zephyrian's expression shifted, and, for a moment, Sarah could see traces of the original personality beneath the network's influence. "Out? We are more than we were. We understand now. The universe is vast and dark and full of wonders that individual minds cannot comprehend. Why would we choose limitation when we can be infinite?" "Because being human isn't about being infinite," Sarah replied, raising the disruptor. "It's about being free." She activated the device. The quantum disruption field expanded outward like ripples on a pond, severing the entanglement links that held the network together. For a brief moment, the jungle fell completely silent. Then, the screaming returned, but now it was different. It was the sound of a vast intelligence being torn apart, its unified consciousness fragmenting into billions of individual thoughts and sensations. The Zephyrians collapsed as their neural connections to the network were severed, their hybrid modifications becoming inert matter. The crystalline growths crumbled away like sand, leaving behind 8 confused and disoriented warriors who had just spent 6 months as part of something larger than themselves. But the intelligence wasn't destroyed. It was wounded, fragmented, but still alive. And now it was angry. The jungle began to move with purpose and rage, every tree and vine and blade of grass turning toward the humans who had dared to wound something that had existed since before their species had learned to walk upright. Sarah and her team had seconds before the forest's full attention focused on their location. "Move," she shouted, hauling the nearest Zephyrian to its feet. "Everyone out, now!" The race back to the landing zone began, with 12 soldiers running through a jungle that had become actively hostile to their existence. Behind them, the intelligence was rebuilding its damaged connections, slowly but surely restoring the network that had been disrupted by human technology and human stubbornness. But it would remember this encounter. It would remember the species that had dared to wound it, and it would prepare for their return. The jungle pursued them with the focused intensity of a predator that had finally found worthy prey. Sarah's lungs burned as she half-carried, half-dragged Commander Vexstar, the lead Zephyrian warrior, through the increasingly hostile forest. Behind them, the other rescued Zephyrians stumbled along with the assistance of her team, their movements sluggish and uncoordinated after months of neural integration. The separation from the network had left them disoriented, like sleepwalkers suddenly thrust into bright sunlight. "How much further?" gasped Rodriguez, his heavy plasma rifle tracking threats that seemed to materialize from every shadow. 2 kilometers, Sarah replied, checking their position on her tactical display. The GPS signals were being distorted by the massive electromagnetic interference generated by the wounded network, but she could still make out their approximate location. "We just need to reach the ground." Beneath her feet exploded upward as massive roots burst through the earth like serpents, reaching for anything human-shaped. Sarah threw herself sideways, dragging Vexstar with her as the grasping tendrils swept through the space where they had been standing. The intelligence was learning. During their first encounter with the jungle, its responses had been curious, almost gentle. It had been trying to understand the Zephyrians, to communicate with them. But now, after feeling the pain of a severed network and the loss of its integrated consciousness, it was done with subtlety. "It's coordinating attacks," Webb shouted over the chaos, his scanner painting impossible readings across his visor. "The entire forest is acting like a single organism. Every tree, every vine, every root system is working together." A wall of thorned vines erupted from the jungle floor, moving to cut off their retreat. Park responded by cranking her music transmitters to maximum volume, filling the air with the discordant sounds of human death metal. The vines hesitated, their growth patterns becoming erratic as the intelligence struggled to process the chaotic auditory input. But the music was only a temporary solution. Sarah could see the adaptation happening in real time as the network learned to filter out the human audio patterns. Whatever alien consciousness controlled this jungle, it was incredibly fast at analyzing and countering new threats. "Vexstar," Sarah said urgently to the Zephyrian commander as they stumbled through a gap in the thorn wall. "I need to know what you learned while you were connected to the network. How do we fight something like this?" The 8-foot-tall warrior's reptilian features were slack with exhaustion, but his eyes still held the sharp intelligence that had made the Zephyrians one of the most feared military forces in the galaxy. "You don't fight it," he replied, his voice carrying strange harmonics left over from his time as part of the collective. "It's older than civilization itself. It has absorbed the knowledge of a dozen extinct species. It knows every military tactic, every strategy, every weapon that has ever been used against it. Then, how are we still alive?" Vexstar's scaled lips curved in what might have been a smile. "Because it's never encountered humans before. Your species doesn't exist in its database. Your tactics are unprecedented." Sarah felt a grim satisfaction at that assessment. Humans had a long history of winning fights they shouldn't have been able to win, usually by doing things that their enemies considered impossible or insane. Sometimes both. "Commander Chen," Park's voice carried a note of panic as she monitored their communications array. "I'm detecting massive seismic activity converging on our position. Whatever's down there, it's big, and it's coming up fast." The ground began to shake, not with the random tremors of geological activity but with the rhythmic pulsing of something vast moving through the earth. Trees swayed in perfect synchronization despite the absence of wind, their movements creating complex patterns that hurt to look at directly. And then, the silence fell. Not the protective bubble created by their dampening device, but something far more ominous. Every sound in the jungle cut off simultaneously, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. Even the rescued Zephyrians stopped their labored breathing, their instincts recognizing a predator so dangerous that even the act of respiration might attract its attention. Sarah held up her hand, signaling her team to freeze. Through the gaps in the canopy above, something was moving. Something impossibly large, blotting out the alien sun with its bulk. She caught glimpses of organic architecture, living structures that defied every principle of biology and physics she had ever learned. The intelligence was revealing its true form. What emerged from the depths of the jungle was less a creature than a living ecosystem. Thousands of trees had grown together into a single entity, their trunks fused into a framework that supported organs of impossible size and complexity. Crystalline neural networks ran along its surface like veins, pulsing with bioluminescent thought patterns that painted the forest floor in shifting colors. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. And it was focused entirely on the small group of humans and Zephyrians who had dared to wound it. Now would be a good time for one of your unprecedented tactics, Vexstar muttered, his natural combat instincts finally overriding his disorientation. Sarah's mind raced through possibilities, discarding conventional weapons and strategies as useless against an opponent of this magnitude. Plasma weapons would be like throwing pebbles at a mountain. Their quantum disruptor had enough charge for one more burst, but it would take time to cycle up to full power. Time they didn't have. The entity's attention focused on their position, and Sarah could feel the weight of its ancient intelligence pressing against her mind. It was trying to establish a neural link, to add her consciousness to its collective the same way it had absorbed the Zephyrians. She felt her thoughts beginning to slow, her individual identity starting to dissolve into something larger and more unified. And then, Rodriguez did something that saved all their lives. He laughed. It wasn't a pleasant laugh, or a confident one. It was the kind of bitter, exhausted laughter that comes from a soldier who has seen too much combat and found himself in a situation so absurd that the only rational response is complete irrationality. The neural pressure vanished as the intelligence recoiled in confusion. Laughter wasn't a response it had ever encountered from a species facing absorption into its collective. Every other race had responded with fear, anger, desperation, or resignation. But humans, apparently, could find humor even in the face of cosmic horror. That's it, Sarah breathed, understanding flooding through her mind. It doesn't understand human psychology. It can copy our tactics and counter our weapons, but it can't predict our emotional responses. She activated her calm system, broadcasting on all frequencies. Park, I need you to record everything that's about to happen and transmit it back to Earth. Full spectrum analysis, quantum encrypted, multiple redundant channels. Ma'am? Because we're about to teach this thing something about human nature. Sarah dropped her weapons and stepped forward, her hands raised in what anyone else would have interpreted as surrender. The entity's attention focused on her completely, its vast consciousness pressing against her mind with the weight of geological ages. But, instead of fighting the connection, she opened her thoughts to it completely. The intelligence flooded into her consciousness, expecting to find the usual patterns of sapient thought that it could analyze, categorize, and absorb. Instead, it encountered something that shouldn't have been possible according to millions of years of accumulated knowledge about biological neural networks. Chaos. Human consciousness wasn't the orderly, logical structure that characterized most sapient species. It was a storm of contradictory impulses, irrational fears, impossible hopes, and emotions that changed faster than quantum states. Sarah's mind was simultaneously terrified of the entity and fascinated by its alien beauty. She was desperately worried about her team's survival while also feeling genuine sympathy for a cosmic intelligence that had spent eons alone in the dark between the stars. The feedback loop that resulted nearly shattered both their minds. The entity reeled back, its thought patterns becoming chaotic as it tried to process emotional states that violated every model of consciousness it had ever encountered. How could a being simultaneously love and hate the same thing? How could fear and curiosity coexist in the same neural pathway? How could such a small, fragile creature contain such contradictory depths? And, most confusing of all, how could something so obviously inferior refuse to be absorbed into something greater than itself? Because being human isn't about being the strongest or the smartest or the most advanced, Sarah said aloud, knowing the entity could hear her thoughts as clearly as her words. It's about being free to choose our own path, even when that path is stupid or dangerous or doomed to failure. The intelligence tried to establish connections with the other humans, seeking patterns it could understand. But Rodriguez was still laughing, his mind a jumble of combat memories and dark humor that made no logical sense. Park was simultaneously terrified and exhilarated by the unprecedented opportunity to study an alien consciousness. Webb was trying to categorize the entity's biological structure while also composing mental poetry about the beauty of its crystalline neural networks. Even the rescued Zephyrians were affected by proximity to human psychological chaos. Their ordered military minds, already destabilized by separation from the collective, began exhibiting human-like emotional complexity that the intelligence had never encountered during their previous integration. The entity's massive form began to waver as its unified consciousness struggled to maintain cohesion in the face of so much psychological disorder. It had evolved to absorb and integrate orderly minds, not to process the beautiful madness that characterized human thought. Sarah felt the moment when it made its decision. The intelligence pulled back, severing all connections and retreating into the depths of the jungle. It wasn't destroyed or defeated, but it was confused in a way it had never experienced before. Humans represented something new in its vast catalog of absorbed civilizations, something that didn't fit any of its existing models. And, until it could understand them, it would leave them alone. The massive entity sank back into the earth, its organic architecture disappearing beneath the forest floor. The jungle remained alive and aware, but its attention was no longer focused on the small group of survivors making their way to the landing zone. They reached the extraction point just as the sun was setting, painting the alien sky in shades of amber and gold. The rescue shuttle was exactly where they had left it, its human-built systems too crude and chaotic for the intelligence to bother analyzing. As they lifted off from the surface of Kepler 442b, Sarah looked down at the jungle that stretched to the horizon in every direction. Somewhere down there, an ancient cosmic intelligence was trying to understand the psychological patterns it had encountered, adding human complexity to its vast database of absorbed knowledge. She wondered if that would ultimately prove to be a good thing or a terrible mistake. Mission accomplished, she reported to the Galactic Council as they entered orbit. The Zephyrian expedition has been successfully rescued. But, even as she spoke, Sarah knew that the real mission was just beginning. Humanity had made contact with something vast and ancient and alien, and they had somehow managed to confuse it enough to buy themselves time. The question was what they would do with that time, and whether human nature would prove to be their salvation or their doom. In the depths of the jungle below, the intelligence continued its analysis, trying to understand a species that could find humor in horror, beauty in chaos, and hope in impossible odds. It was a puzzle that might take centuries to solve. Fortunately for humanity, they had always been good at staying one step ahead of anyone trying to figure them out. After all, most of the time, they couldn't figure themselves out either. And that, perhaps, was their greatest strength of all.